How you doing? Spectator violence, which is the topic for this particular um, mini lecture, and it's one of those interesting things because oftentimes when we think about deviance and violence, we tend to focus on, and rightfully so, athletes, coaches, managers, things like that. But when you look at a lot of these sport violence, not just here but also around the world, what you start to see is the role of the consumer, the spectator, involved in violence, and how important that becomes. I mean, logistically, security and security studies is a huge part of the sport management industry, and realizing how to control. Anytime you have like the University of Michigan or Penn State, Tennessee, places like that, USC in the out in the Coliseum and stuff, you're talking about well over 100,000 people watching a college football game, and there's a lot of potential for bad things to happen there. And so when we start looking at trying to understand research, it's kind of interesting because there's very little research, and we just don't know a whole lot about how consuming or watching sports influences everyday violence. There are starting to be some things that come out in terms of consumption of violence, but that's in general, and that includes violent movies, video games, and so on and so forth. But there hasn't been a ton of stuff to look at. This understanding of consumption and how it relates to everyday activities and interactions. We do know that spectators at non-contact sports tend to have lower rates of violence, and that's when you look at spectators at contact sports or these power and performance sports, they tend to have higher rates of violence. But especially here in the United States, what we constantly have to do is compare and contrast that with rates today as compared to where they were 50 years ago, 100 years ago, so on and so forth. There's always this great example of an early Major League Baseball game back in the National League, and the players refused to come out of the dugout because the fans were discharging their firearms into the air because they were upset about some call that an umpire had made. Well, what goes up must come down, so they're worried about going out in the outfield and getting hit by those bullets and that kind of thing. So keeping in mind that it is relative. Now, recently, as recent as last year, you had the violence. It was politically motivated in charge, but in Egypt, with I think 75 people that died at a soccer match. You talk about hooliganism and things like that around the world. It is definitely one of those very, very important issues. So, when we talk about fan violence, the irony here is, the vast majority of violence occurs after basically a win, when people get all excited, and it kind of relates to some of that collective behaviors research where you get all excited, you're tearing down the goalpost, and one thing leads to another, and there's a sense of losing the individual in the crowd, and that crowd sort of takes on a life of its own, and the mob mentality takes over, that kind of thing. Surprisingly, here in the United States, we've been fairly lucky. There's not a ton, relatively speaking, not a ton of fan violence, and a lot of that is because, yes, you're able to go and attend your sporting events live, but increasingly, a lot of us are watching it on TV, through the internet, on mobile devices. Tablet technology is increasing, and so that's going to influence fan violence and how we understand it in the future. Wakefield and Wan talked about, and I always thought this was kind of interesting, is that we want to understand the dysfunctional fan, so let's understand them so that we can do something about it. And that's kind of what you had here. And these two individuals tend to take things from much more of a psychological point of view, but that still relates to what it is that we're talking about. And so they identify what a dysfunctional fan is, and then they start to go from there. Sorry about that. We had to take a brief little pause there, but we are back. So, dysfunctional fans. And one of the things that they really focused on in this particular piece was looking at and trying to understand, identify the dysfunctional fan, identify how that individual within a particular section, how that either exacerbates other fan behavior around them or how it's causing problems. And so what they want to do is they're focused on the safety of the environment. And they talk a lot about Major League Baseball and that kind of things. And again, what's really important for us is you take this psychological or social psychological information that sport managers use all the time, and they're making recommendations and trying to solve this particular issue. And some of the things that they talk about, and you see this a lot even in Major League Baseball right now, is more undercover security, the fan call-in hotlines. This is at if you want to talk about Boston Red Sox, they've had really a decent amount of luck with this, where they have phone numbers posted, and if you can call anonymously and report someone who's acting up, and then security will come over and that kind of thing. Roger Goodell and some of the security measures of the NFL, what he actually does himself personally is he and his daughter will attend. They try to get roughly 6 to 8 games a year, which is roughly half the season, and they try to attend different venues throughout the United States so they can get a sense for the fan experience. Now, the problem is a lot of venues, facilities, and organizations, it's very complicated when we talk about putting on, for example, a football game, because the team doesn't generally own the facility that they're playing in. They tend to lease it for a certain amount of time, and so then you have like SMG that's actually running the facility, and that's just a private organization, and then you may subcontract out security and that kind of thing. So cost becomes something that's extremely important. Now we know that the NBA and the NFL both actually have individuals that are part of their league structure that serve. They have kind of a police background, and they're there essentially to help develop security strategies, not only for the NFL or the NBA in general, player conduct, that kind of things, but also in terms of working with these on-the-ground security personnel at these particular facilities. So taking a hold of spectator violence, realizing that there are ideas out there. Southern Mississippi University actually has an entire center that's devoted to some of this information, and it's basically, it's for us, it's a nice amalgamation of talking about the sport industry, sport management, and how it relates to a lot of these particular academic ideas.